We can clearly see the impact of our sanctions policy on our own industry, on our economy. We're in a phase of decline. With this policy, we're putting the future of coming generations at risk. Right now, it's impossible to calculate when a war, even a conventional war between NATO and Russia, might actually break out. And if that happens, the risk would no longer be controllable.
If you look at Western politics with the current generation of politicians who've tied their own fate to supporting Ukraine and to the war in Ukraine, there's simply no way to find a path back to peace. Against the current, about the person. Hello and welcome to Against the Current. I'm here to show you positions and perspectives that the propaganda media prefer to keep quiet about. With the help of Western countries, Ukraine is now carrying out attacks deep into Russian territory. The Russians are responding with similar strikes on factories and military facilities inside Ukraine. Are we getting close to this war expanding into a major European conflict? Are we already talking about the war in Ukraine as the original catastrophe of the 21st century? That's what I'll be discussing with the highest-ranking NATO general in the German armed forces, the former Inspector General of the Bundeswehr and former chairman of the NATO Military Committee, who also chaired both the NATO Ukraine and NATO Russia councils. Welcome, Harald Kujat. General, when you hear statements like the one from your well-known colleague, General Newman, "We're ready to fight tonight," what does that say to you? Is that really the tone we should be striking right now?
Well, I usually don't comment on what active generals or current defense policymakers say. I can only speak about it in general terms. Right now, we're in a difficult and also dangerous situation. It's difficult because the Western goals for ending the war in Ukraine simply can't be achieved. Over the past 2.5 years, we've seen that neither the European member states, nor NATO, nor Europe as a whole have taken any initiative toward a negotiated peace. But now, France, the United Kingdom, and Germany in particular have, so to speak, taken the lead in this movement. They've also developed a position paper for the upcoming negotiations, on the side of Ukraine, though, clearly on Ukraine's side. That's an extremely difficult situation, and I might come back to that later. The situation is dangerous because, as you just described, Ukraine has been increasingly striking strategic targets inside Russia, deep within Russian territory. And that's having an effect. We shouldn't overlook that.
Das hat auch Wirkung, das darf man nicht außer Acht lassen. Nicht die Wirkung,
not the effect Ukraine is aiming for, that the strategic initiative or the strategic advantage shifts to Ukraine, or as is increasingly claimed in the West, that there's a turning point in this war in Ukraine's favor, but rather an effect that creates domestic pressure on Putin to change course in this war. That pressure comes from the military. They're saying, we're capable of ending this war very quickly by military means. We have the means to do it. We have the military capabilities. And the situation on the battlefield allows us to use those capabilities in a way that could bring this war to a military end very quickly.
Dass der Krieg militärisch sehr schnell beendet werden kann. Das ist die eine Sicht der Dinge. Die andere ist aber auch die.
That's one way to look at it. But the other side is that people are increasingly feeling the effects of these attacks on the energy supply, on the availability of gasoline, and so on. And there's also growing impatience among the public to finally bring this war to an end. That combination is what I consider both difficult and dangerous in this situation. And when the West says, of course we're ready to defend NATO territory, I see that as self-evident. The real question is whether that's truly what's called for right now or not. And that's a question we should take a closer look at.
Dieser Frage müssten wir dann gleich noch einmal nachgehen.
Is that really the order of the day? How would you answer that question?
Ja, es gibt zwei Situationen.
Yes, there are two situations we need to look at in this context. One is the threat assessment, the European threat assessment, which assumes that by 2029, Russia will be capable of attacking NATO, Western countries, or the Baltic states, whoever it may be. In the past, we've heard other versions too, that the Russians could do it sooner, that they could do it tomorrow even, or that last year was supposedly our last peaceful summer. None of that has happened. So the question is this threat assessment actually realistic, at least to some extent?
Wirklich realitätsnah zumindest. Und wenn man dann betrachtet, wie die amerikanische Bedrohungsanalyse.
And if you look at how the American threat assessment is framed, take the one from 2024, 2025, or even 2026, it says in the first two that Russia neither intends nor is militarily capable of attacking NATO. And this year, the threat assessment doesn't even address that point anymore. It only talks about the conflicts of interest between the United States and Russia in fairly general terms. So that means this threat assessment, contrary to what's sometimes reported in German media, is not shared by the United States, and it's not shared by NATO either.
Nicht von den Vereinigten Staaten geteilt, wird auch nicht von der NATO geteilt. Denn die NATO verfügt nicht über eine
NATO doesn't have enough of its own intelligence capabilities. It relies on the assessments of its member states. And of course, the American contribution carries more weight than basically all the others combined, because the United States has enormous intelligence-gathering resources. The threat analysis is produced by 7 American intelligence agencies. So, neither the American threat assessment nor NATO's threat assessment matches what we're hearing from politicians today or what's being written in the media. But that doesn't mean a conflict between Russia and NATO can be ruled out.
Zwischen Russland und der NATO ausgeschlossen wäre. Nein, sondern die Situation.
No, the situation is actually getting worse. It's escalating because of what you just described, the shift of combat operations from the battlefield to Russia's strategic rear areas. We can see that the Ukrainian forces are on the defensive, really only capable of holding out at this point. We also see that Russia has made significant gains in recent weeks. The Luhansk region is completely occupied by Russia, and in the Donetsk region, those are the two critical parts of the Donbass. The Russians are also continuing to advance, practically every day.
Machen die Russen auch weiter praktisch täglich Fortschritte. Das ist auch der entscheidende Grund dafür, weshalb die Ukraine.
That's also the key reason why Ukraine has shifted its operations toward targets deep inside Russia, focusing on fuel supplies by striking refineries and loading stations. But that doesn't bring about a decision on the battlefield. It's basically a kind of side maneuver, one that's being heavily supported by Western countries. On the one hand, through the provision of components for long-range drone systems, so hardware, and on the other hand, through software that enables precise targeting, for example, the American system Palantir.
Das führt uns zu der Frage,
that brings us to the question, what does this support from NATO member states, from Europeans, actually mean for these attacks? My interpretation is this. If an attack can only be carried out successfully with Western support for a state, let me simplify that, either because the necessary weapon systems, and especially the precision targeting, are only possible that way, then legally it may fall into a gray area. But politically, from the perspective of the state being attacked, whoever that may be, in this case it's Russia, it clearly amounts to participation in the war. And of course that naturally leads to a reaction from the other side.
Natürlich zu einer Reaktion der anderen Seite. Und diese Reaktion ist auch bereits angekündigt worden von.
And that reaction has already been announced by Russia. On the one hand, through intensified counterattacks on Ukrainian targets, weapons factories, and similar sites, but also through possible attacks on Western facilities that supply this material, this essential equipment. My impression is that so far, the Russian leadership has responded with great restraint, very cautiously, because they know, of course, that a reaction like the one I just described and the one being discussed in Russia would mean a dramatic escalation. And with any escalation, there's always the risk that the other side will escalate in return.
Dass auch die andere Seite dann wieder eskaliert. Das heißt also, es wechselseitige
That means there's a mutual raising of the threshold of danger, and at some point, you reach a stage where this escalation strategy can no longer be controlled. On top of that, the Russian approach to escalation is different from the Western one. The Western strategy usually unfolds in small steps. You wait to see how the other side reacts. If there's a response and it's measured, or if there's no response at all, then you move to the next step. With Russia, it's different. Their tolerance level is very high, but once that threshold is crossed, they strike back very hard, and they're willing to accept further escalation as a consequence.
Nehmen dann auch eine weitere Eskalation in Kauf. Die Frage ist also, wann ist dieser Punkt erreicht?
So the question is, when do we reach the point where Western support for Ukraine's far-reaching drone attacks on Russian targets leads Russia to say, this is the moment we can no longer tolerate it, we can no longer accept this support, and will respond accordingly? What I mean, in one sentence, is this. Right now, the risk is impossible to calculate when a conventional war between NATO and Russia could actually break out. And if that moment does come, the risk would no longer be controllable.
Wenn dieser Fall eintritt, auch nicht mehr beherrschbar.
Inzwischen gibt es ja ein Abkommen zwischen der Bundeswehr.
There's now an agreement between the Federal Republic of Germany and Ukraine to exchange military information. Missiles like the Taurus are produced in cooperation with German companies, some of them, for example, in Munich. The use of Starlink, Elon Musk's satellite system for the Ukrainian military, is largely funded by Germany. Data are being provided, missiles are being provided. So are we already a party to the war?
Flugkörper zur Verfügung gestellt, sind wir bereits Kriegspartei.
Naja, das ist, wie ich es eben schon sagte.
Well, as I said earlier, in my view, under international law, this is a gray area. If you look at the United Nations definition of aggression, it really is a gray area. But that's not the decisive point. What matters is the political assessment of this kind of support. And I can only repeat what I've said before. If that support is necessary to carry out a successful attack, then the threshold has been crossed. In other words, if the attack couldn't take place without that support, then we're looking at exactly the situation you just described.
Genau die Situation, die Sie eben beschrieben haben.
Der russische Präsident Putin hat
Russian President Putin said back in September 2024 that Ukraine couldn't possibly carry out these large-scale attacks deep inside Russian territory without permission from the West and without Western support. That would mean it's now in Moscow's hands to decide whether the war will be expanded.
von Moskau darüber zu entscheiden, ob der Krieg ausgeweitet wird.
Das ist richtig. Also das ist genau der Punkt, den ich meine. Es ist eine
That's right.
eine politische Entscheidung.
And that's exactly the point I'm making. At its core, this is a political decision, not a decision under international law, and not a legal one. But that means the West's behavior doesn't take that into account. In other words, the way the West is acting assumes that we're willing to accept the risk that this could lead to entering the war or to a reaction from Russia. So we're relying on the Russian leadership, especially the Russian president, to show enough reason and rationality to pull back from that decision, at least for now.
Zurückweicht. Jedenfalls noch zurückweicht. Wir wissen ja nicht genau, wann die Toleranzschwelle.
We don't really know when Russia's tolerance threshold will be crossed. Maybe even the Russian leadership itself doesn't yet know when that point will come. But at some point, it could happen. And I think it's downright reckless to base our policy on the assumption that Russia or the Russian president will always act rationally and reasonably, while we, without any regard for our own security interests, provide this support without restraint and refuse to think about the consequences of our actions.
Über die Konsequenzen unseres Handelns nachzudenken.
Bedeutet dies,
Does that mean we're handing control over escalation dominance to a foreign power?
in die Hände einer fremden Macht?
Russland hat
Russia already holds the upper hand when it comes to escalation, but we're essentially putting the decision about when the next level of escalation is reached into the hands of the Russian leadership.
in die Hand der russischen Führung.
Nun haben wir eine Situation, in der der russische
Now we have a situation where the Russian president said a few days ago, this war will be decided on the battlefield.
auf dem Schlachtfeld.
And that comes after, at first he had kept things rather low-key. After the talks, after the discussion with U.S. President Trump in Anchorage, you could say he kept the ball down. So what caused this change of mind?
Woher rührt der Sinneswandel?
Ja, das ist völlig richtig.
Yes, that's absolutely right. Putin apparently trusted that. And I have to say honestly, I was hoping that what was discussed in Anchorage, whether you call it an agreement or not, people can argue about that. Anyway, it was talked about between the two presidents. The idea was that Russia would keep the two Donbass regions and that Russia would, at least in part, give up the other two regions, Zaporizhia and Kherson. That was the basis for future negotiations, at least as it was understood by both the American and Russian sides. And that was also the reason why Putin apparently slowed down the pace on the battlefield over the past few months.
Auf dem Schlachtfeld in den letzten Monaten zurückgefahren hat. Wollte offensichtlich nicht bewusst provozieren.
He obviously didn't want to provoke anyone on purpose or put that agreement at risk. But that's just my personal interpretation. Of course, I don't actually know if that was the case. In any event, the fact is it was taken into account. And now, after the G7 summit, the impression has emerged, let me put it this way, that the Americans no longer stand by that agreement. And that inevitably means Russia has to draw the conclusion. We can't achieve our goals through negotiations, at least not the ones we discussed with the United States. So, we have to pursue our interests on the battlefield.
Unsere Interessen auf dem Schlachtfeld durchsetzen. Und das stellen wir ja seit etwa 2-3 Wochen auch fest.
And we've been seeing that for about 2 or 3 weeks now, that the pace of attacks there has clearly increased, and that Russian forces are also making gains, both in the Donbass, meaning the Donetsk region, and further north in the Sumy region, which isn't one of those 4 regions. So, that's how I interpret what Putin said. But what does that mean for us? First of all, it confirms once again something all experts have known for months, if not longer, that Ukraine is unable to turn the strategic situation on the battlefield in its favor.
Auf dem Gefechtsfeld nicht zu ihren Gunsten wenden kann. Die russische Überlegenheit personell und materiell ist
Russia's superiority, both in manpower and equipment, is simply overwhelming. And beyond that, as you just mentioned, Russia holds escalation dominance. That means it can respond to every move Ukraine makes, even with Western support, by taking the next higher step in escalation. As a result, we're moving closer and closer to a situation where Ukraine can no longer prevent defeat on the battlefield, and that means a military defeat for Ukraine. The only way to prevent that military defeat is if negotiations take place beforehand.
Wenn es zuvor zu Verhandlungen kommt. Zu Verhandlungen über eine friedliche Beilegung.
When it comes to negotiations for a peaceful resolution of this conflict, it's clear that both sides will have to give up their maximum demands and that a compromise will be necessary. But to insist, as the so-called E3 paper does with those 5 points, that the Russians should drop their maximum demands before negotiations even begin, that's just unrealistic. Ukraine won't give up its maximum demands before talks either. What we need is a situation that at least creates the prospect of negotiations on these positions, where compromise becomes possible. That's the crucial point, and that's where we have to do our part.
Das ist der entscheidende Punkt. Und dazu müssen wir beitragen. Bisher vermag ich nicht zu erkennen,
So far, I don't see that happening on the Western side, especially not among the Europeans. The Americans, yes, but not the Europeans. For example, if you look at the agreement between Germany and Ukraine from April 14th, the so-called strategic partnership, it says that Germany will work to build consensus on Ukraine joining NATO. From my point of view, that's something that actually blocks negotiations, because Russia's demand that Ukraine not become a NATO member has been on the table for many years, and Russia is certainly not going to give that up. And if at the same time there's also a demand that after a peace agreement there should be a security mission in Ukraine carried out by Western or European military forces, then that too is something that prevents negotiations.
Ebenfalls ein Punkt, der Verhandlungen verhindert. Das wird es nicht geben. Also,
That's not going to happen. I expect a bit more realism in European politics, more effort to actually reach a compromise and not to contribute to hardening Ukraine's position. Ukraine has, in the past, gone very far in showing its willingness to compromise. Just think of the negotiations in Istanbul. But we also need to point something out, and I want to bring up the issue of NATO membership again. The Ukrainian constitution is based on the Declaration of Sovereignty from 1990, when it was still the Socialist Soviet Republic of Ukraine. In that document, the foundation of the Ukrainian state was laid out: no membership in military alliances, a neutral status, and no acquisition, possession, or control of nuclear weapons.
kein Erwerb, Besitz oder Verfügungsgewalt über Nuklearwaffen. Diese Festlegung als sozusagen als Säule
This definition, as the pillars of the Ukrainian state, was confirmed a year later in the Declaration of Independence, which was supported by a referendum with strong approval from the population. And that declaration was then included in the preamble of the Ukrainian constitution.
das ist also
So in essence, that was the founding statement, the commitment of Ukraine to its own statehood. Then, in 2019, Ukraine amended its constitution to include the goal of integration as a state objective into the Euro-Atlantic community, meaning also into the North Atlantic Alliance.
Also auch in die Nordatlantische Allianz eingefügt wurde. Wir haben also hier einen eklatanten Widerspruch innerhalb.
So what we have here is a clear contradiction within the Constitution. But we have to start from a democratic rule of law perspective and say that we must respect the provisions of the Ukrainian constitution. And we shouldn't be pushing Ukraine, so to speak, in a direction that goes against its own constitution. That's what I'm seeing right now. I actually expect that if we talk about a Western system of values and constitutional compliance is part of that system, then we should hold ourselves to those same standards when it comes to Ukraine. The second point is that Ukraine joining NATO is completely unrealistic. No country can just say, I want to become a NATO member, and then automatically join. Every candidate has to be invited by all member states, and that requires full consensus.
Im Konsens dazu eingeladen werden. Dieser Konsens besteht nicht. Wir wissen das von
That consensus doesn't exist. We know that from several countries, including some in Europe. But we also know very clearly that the United States does not accept it. Both the American president and the Secretary of State have said that repeatedly. So why are we doing this? Why are we putting ourselves in opposition to U.S. policy? There's another point to consider. Article 10 of the North Atlantic Treaty, the Washington Treaty, requires that any candidate for membership must bring an added measure of security for all member states. So it's not, as is often suggested, that a country simply joins NATO and automatically comes under the protection of the others. NATO is, after all, an alliance based on collective mutual security.
kollektiver gegenseitiger Sicherheit. Das heißt also, die Ukraine muss die Sicherheit.
That means Ukraine would have to increase the security of all member states. But that's not the case. What would actually happen if Ukraine joined is that NATO would be importing a future conflict with Russia into the alliance. That's completely out of the question. And as for the other aspects, like Ukraine having to align with the values of NATO member states, I don't even want to get into that. I'll just give two examples. First, the protection of minorities in Ukraine is not guaranteed at all. And second, there's rampant corruption reaching all the way up to the highest levels of government. Those are just two of many reasons that rule out membership.
Zwei nur von vielen Ausschlussgründen für eine Mitgliedschaft.
Hat sich im Rahmen der russischen
Have Russia's war objectives changed in any way? Back in February 2022, Putin justified the invasion by saying Ukraine's neutral status had to be guaranteed, that the population in the Donbass needed protection, that the shelling of civilians by militias and also by the Ukrainian army had to stop, and that Ukraine had to be denazified. Now he's talking about Novorossiya. And if you look at the old Catherine-era territories of Novorossiya, that includes Kharkiv and above all Odessa. Does that mean Russia's war goals are expanding?
Bedeutet dies eine Ausweitung der russischen Kriegsziele?
Ja, lassen Sie mich zunächst noch zu den Eingangsbemerkungen sagen.
Let me first respond to the opening remarks. He based his reasoning on what I just explained, that, according to its constitution, Ukraine is a neutral, non-aligned state, a state of permanent neutrality that doesn't belong to any military bloc. That's the first point. The second point is that he refers to the civil war that broke out after the 2014 coup, when the two Donbass regions declared themselves independent people's republics. That's how the civil war began, bringing serious hardship to the civilian population in those regions, which are mostly inhabited by Russian-speaking Ukrainians. And in fact, before the war even started, Russia tried to stabilize the situation. On December 17, 2021, it sent draft treaties to the United States and to NATO. Those drafts were very demanding, with some major maximum demands, and they were presented in a very sharp tone. But they weren't taken up. That opportunity to prevent the war through negotiations was missed. Now, speaking from my perspective, back in 1997, with the NATO-Russia Founding Act, we created a mechanism that was meant to make it possible, in cases of crises and conflicts affecting the security interests of both sides, to resolve them together, and in doing so, to prevent a war between NATO and Russia.
Einen Krieg zwischen NATO und Russland zu verhindern. Das war das russische Interesse. Wir haben dem
That was Russia's interest, and we went along with it. It's also reflected in the NATO Founding Act. Back then, the view was, and the years that followed confirmed it, that crises and conflicts would arise in that area, in the region of the former Warsaw Pact states, but also in the three Baltic countries, which were former Soviet republics, and especially in Ukraine. That opportunity was missed. I want to emphasize that once again. Later, in February 2022, Russia justified its actions by claiming these were independent people's republics.
Dass es sich hier unabhängige Volksrepubliken handelt. Es ist wenige Tage vorher hat Russland dann zum
Just a few days earlier, Russia had, for the first time in many years, recognized those so-called people's republics as independent states. That hadn't been the case before. After that, a mutual assistance agreement was signed, and Russia then referred to Article 51 of the UN Charter, citing a request for support. Of course, that was essentially an attempt to justify the attack. That needs to be said clearly. At least that's how I interpret it. But in any case, that attempt was made.
Aber zumindest ist dieser Versuch gemacht worden. Natürlich war die Berufung Russlands auf Artikel 1.
Of course, Russia's reference to Article 51 of the UN Charter and the request for assistance from those two so-called Donbass republics was an attempt to frame the whole thing in a way that would appear consistent with international law. That's quite clear. But at least that attempt was made. Has Russia's objective changed? Actually, right at the beginning of this war, there was already discussion about whether Russia also intended to take Odessa and Kharkiv, two cities that are typically Russian in character. In the case of Odessa, that plays a special strategic role, because taking Odessa would prevent Ukraine from maintaining access to the Black Sea.
Dass die Ukraine weiter Zugang zum Schwarzen Meer hat. Zweitens würde man sozusagen den Schulterschluss mit Transnistrien herstellen.
Second, that would mean, so to speak, forming a kind of alliance with Transnistria, where Russian soldiers are stationed. But of course, there's also that event that still plays a big role in the Russian consciousness, the one where Russian-speaking Ukrainians were driven into the trade union building in Odessa. It was set on fire, and they were burned alive. That obviously matters. And finally, the same goes for Kharkiv. Odessa, like Kharkiv, is a typically Russian city. In Odessa's case, there's also the fact that it was founded by Catherine the Great. All of that, in a country like Russia, which tends to think very historically, always plays a role.
die sehr historisch auch denken, immer eine Rolle. Und Charkiw spielt natürlich auch eine Rolle strategisch.
And of course, Kharkiv also plays a role strategically because of its location. But lately, there's something else to consider. As I said, that was certainly one of the options at the beginning. Whether that's still being pursued as a real strategic goal, I'm not sure. It looks that way, but based on what's been happening on the battlefield, I don't have clear evidence for it. Yes, the attacks around Zaporizhia have also intensified, and that's the precondition if you want to push further toward Odessa. But whether that's really the case, I can't say. Still, there's another factor that comes into play.
Das kann ich nicht sagen. Etwas anderes kommt aber hinzu. Auch das hat Putin vor kurzem erklärt.
Putin also said recently that Russia is stepping up its attacks on Sumy. And the reason, from the Russian point of view, is that they want to create a kind of security zone there, one that's supposed to prevent another Ukrainian attack on the Kursk region. That actually happened, I don't remember exactly, maybe 6 or 7 months ago, when Russian forces were active in the Kursk area. The goal back then was clearly to capture the Kursk nuclear power plant, because honestly, there's nothing else there worth taking. So now, in the Sumy area too, Russian military activity has clearly increased, which basically confirms what Putin said.
Was im Grunde unterstützt, was Putin gesagt hat.
Wir haben ja den Putsch gehabt auf dem Maidan.
We had the coup on the Maidan, which was at least in part supported by the West. Then we saw the talks in Istanbul fail after Western interference through Boris Johnson, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And now, from the Russian point of view, we're seeing the collapse of what they call the spirit of anchorage. So is Russia's response now to push further toward Odessa, toward Kharkiv, in order to put more pressure on the West?
Auf Kharkiv, den Westen stärker unter Druck zu bringen.
Das ist eine Spekulation, aber sie ist nicht.
That's speculation, but it's not far-fetched, I have to say. I think it's entirely possible. I mean, I'd probably think the same way if I had no other option but to push through my strategic interests on the battlefield. If the option of negotiating an end to the war, just as I had assessed it and as it had been promised to me, no longer exists, then I could take things a step further. I could start pursuing broader goals that wouldn't have fit with my cautious, tough, restrained approach up to now. That's possible. But as I said, it's speculation.
Wie gesagt, das ist eine Spekulation.
Wäre denn eine Ukraine
Would a Ukraine without access to the Black Sea even be viable as an independent state?
überhaupt noch,
Or would that mean the country ends up being crushed between East and West?
dass dieses Land zwischen Ost und West zerrieben wird?
Naja, das ist ja immer das Problem. Das ist ja immer
Well,
das Problem.
that's always the problem, isn't it? That's always the question. Where does Ukraine belong? Does Ukraine belong to the West, or does it belong to the Russian sphere of influence?
Mir kommt ja immer in den Sinn, was
And what always comes to mind for me is what Henry Kissinger wrote in an op-ed back in 2014. He wrote that Ukraine must not become a forward post of Russia, but also not a forward post of the West, meaning NATO. If it wants to prosper, to develop, and to live in security, it has to build a bridge between East and West. And that's just as relevant today as it was in 2014. And that also fits with what I said earlier about Ukraine's founding constitution and its principle of permanent neutrality.
der Ukraine, die ständige Neutralität. Nur die ständige Neutralität und die Blockfreiheit.
Only permanent neutrality and non-alignment make it possible to build those bridges between East and West. And that would actually fit with the Russian strategy they've been following since the mid-90s, creating a buffer zone between NATO and Russia to prevent a direct confrontation, to avoid a war. In other words, a kind of cordon sanitaire between Russia and NATO. But I'll take it one step further. When the war in Ukraine finally ends, it'll be like pulling the cork out of a bottle. The end of the war means that cork is removed.
Das Ende des Krieges bedeutet, dass der Korken entfernt wird. Und dann entsteht die Möglichkeit, die Option.
And then there's the possibility, the option, to create a European peace and security order where both Russia and Ukraine have their place. After all, we share the same continent with Russia. That's not something we can change. So we have to try to find a way that stabilizes the international situation here in Europe. a way that offers us and future generations a future in peace, in security, and in prosperity. All of that is at risk right now. We can clearly see the effects of our sanctions policy on our own industry, on our economy. We're in a period of decline as well.
Des Niedergangs auch. Wir gefährden die Zukunft.
We're putting the future of coming generations at risk with this kind of policy. And yet our Constitution, the Basic Law, is actually a peace constitution. Remember, the Parliamentary Council that created the Basic Law back in 1949 was shaped by a century marked by 2 world wars. That's why they wrote into the preamble that Germany should serve the peace of the world as an equal member in a united Europe, meaning peace for Ukraine as well as peace with Russia. And the Constitution goes even further. Even joining NATO comes with a condition. It says that the federal government may take part in a system of mutual collective security.
Gegenseitiger kollektiver Sicherheit einordnen. Jetzt habe ich aber etwas ausgelassen, was auch in der Verfassung.
But I left something out that's also written in the Constitution. The full sentence says, the federal government may join a system of collective mutual security to preserve peace. So where do we see that today? Where within NATO are we actually acting to preserve peace? What are we doing to live up to what the Constitution demands of us? I don't see it. What I see is that throughout this entire war, we've been feeding it with money, with equipment, with political support. But we haven't made a single real attempt to end this war peacefully, even though that's exactly what our Constitution requires.
Wie es eigentlich unsere Verfassung erfordert.
If the federal governments, and we have to speak of several by now, fail to live up to the constitutional mandate for peace, if Germany has, for almost 5 years now, made no contribution toward promoting peace in Ukraine, does that mean these federal governments are acting in violation of the Constitution?
Naja, der Verfassungsauftrag ist eindeutig.
Well, the constitutional mandate is absolutely clear. There's really no doubt about that. And it's not just this one provision that's being ignored. The same thing, speaking now as a former military officer, applies to the armed forces. The Constitution is crystal clear there too. It says the federal government establishes armed forces for defense. That means the military must be capable of defending our country and our people and of working for the well-being of our citizens. But in 2011, we carried out a reform of the Bundeswehr that was called the realignment of the armed forces.
Die nannte sich die Neuausrichtung der Bundeswehr. Und Neuausrichtung hieß weg von der
And that realignment meant moving away from national and alliance defense, focusing only on foreign missions. Well, the Federal Constitutional Court has, in several landmark rulings, granted the federal government broad leeway for such missions abroad, but tied to very strict conditions, of course. Still, the basic principle, the actual mandate, hasn't been abolished. So we've been living with this situation where the Constitution was violated, where we didn't adhere to it. And now, for some time, there's been an effort to restore our ability for national and alliance defense.
Diese Fähigkeit der Landes- und Bündnisverteidigung wiederherzustellen. Dazu verpflichtet uns die Verfassung. Dazu brauchen wir.
That's what our Constitution requires of us. And by the way, we don't need some sense of threat, as is so often claimed. It's enough that we simply carry out the constitutional mandate. That's the key point. We have to be able to defend our country. And since I have the floor, let me add one more thing. I'm not against doing more for the Bundeswehr. People often talk about rearmament. That term always carries a negative tone. But no, the Bundeswehr really does have to fulfill this constitutional duty.
Muss tatsächlich diesen Verfassungsauftrag erfüllen. Das ist der eine Aspekt. Der zweite Aspekt ist, die Bundeswehr.
That's one aspect. The second aspect is this. The German armed forces also have to make a contribution to peace, and they can do that by helping to create a balance of power. When there's a balance of power, neither side is tempted to actually launch an attack. That's why Helmut Schmidt said a balance of power is a necessary condition for peace. But he also said it's not a sufficient one. For it to be sufficient, that balance of power needs political stabilization.
Ein Gleichgewicht der Kräfte, die politische Stabilisierung. Das heißt, wir müssen mit der anderen Seite reden.
That means we have to talk with the other side. We need to understand what interests they represent. We have to be able to determine exactly what capabilities they have. We need to identify what goals they're pursuing. And we have to try, through measures like arms control and disarmament, to adjust this balance of power. That includes lowering it on both sides to a lower level, and in doing so, further reducing the risk of war. At the same time, we also need to create military confidence-building measures that allow us to clearly see what's happening on the other side. In the past, we've abolished or withdrawn from some of the most fundamental disarmament and arms control agreements that were essential to our security.
Vereinbarungen abgeschafft, gekündigt. Da ist der INF-Vertrag, der für unsere Sicherheit von
There's the INF Treaty, which was of existential importance for our security and which led to the destruction of an entire category of several thousand nuclear-capable weapon systems. Then there's the Open Skies Treaty, which was terminated. That treaty had allowed us to get our own picture of developments on the other side, giving us a solid foundation for assessing threats. And I just want to mention those two. By now, the Treaty on Intercontinental Strategic Systems has also expired, along with many others. There's an enormous need for action here. An enormous need for action. But none of it is happening. There are no talks with the other side, no efforts toward disarmament or arms control, and no efforts to build trust.
Noch gibt es das Bemühen vertrauensbildende Maßnahmen. Das heißt also, das, was von unseren Politikern
That means that what our politicians are calling for, what Helmut Schmidt in particular once called for, was to create a sufficient level of political stabilization. Stabilization that would allow us to say, now we at least have some international stability that gives us a real prospect for peace. But none of that is happening. What we're doing right now is only the first part. I'm not against it, let me repeat that. I'm absolutely convinced that the Bundeswehr must make a major contribution to alliance defense, one that matches our capabilities and the size of our country, and also contribute to maintaining a balance of power. But this cannot happen in isolation.
Aber dies darf nicht allein geschehen. Dieser isolierte Ansatz ist nicht geeignet.
This isolated approach isn't suited to creating peace. In fact, it carries the risk of triggering an arms race. And that's exactly the situation we're facing right now. An arms race is the shortest and most direct path to war. Do you see that as a political failure? Well, if politics doesn't live up to its responsibilities, then of course it fails. Even in terms of the Constitution? Yes, even in terms of the Constitution. Absolutely clear. What's interesting, though, is that this isn't being discussed at all in our media. There's a kind of silent agreement to leave out issues that are actually of existential importance for the future of our country and our people.
Existenzieller Bedeutung sind aus der Berichterstattung auszuklammern.
Sehen Sie in dem Satz.
Do you see the statement by then U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin? We want to show the Russians that they can't keep doing what they've done. As a contribution to the peace order in Europe? Or is it actually undermining that peace order?
Naja, dies muss man sehen das ist eine
You have to see that in context. That's a geopolitical statement. He put it in simple terms. What he meant, and other American politicians have said the same thing, was the intention to push Russia back politically, industrially, economically, and also militarily. The goal was to reduce its influence to the point where Russia's role in shaping a new multipolar world order could practically be ignored. And that would allow the main focus of American engagement to shift toward a future confrontation with the real challenger, China.
Herausforderer, nämlich mit China, verlagern kann. Russland sollte nicht mehr der Herausforderer.
Russia should no longer be the international challenger to the United States. And with that reduction, so to speak, to a much lower level, it should also no longer serve as China's supporter in this emerging new multipolar world order. So China is the only country that could, and in fact does, pose a threat to the influence of the United States as the dominant global power, politically, economically, technologically, and increasingly also militarily. That's the key point. That's what Austin's statement was referring to. And we can see that this development is making enormous progress, especially as the countries of the so-called Global South are focusing more and more on this core group of technologies, on the BRICS nations, through association agreements and through membership.
Durch Assoziierungsabkommen, durch Mitgliedschaft, ja sogar ein NATO-Mitgliedstaat hat ja.
Yes, even a NATO member state has actually asked to join the BRICS organization, Turkey to be specific. And that really makes you stop and think about what that means. But we can see this happening in many areas. We saw it as well in the conflict with Iran. Iran is a close ally of China and Russia, and that, of course, plays a major role in the background, alongside the regional challenges. So we really are in a situation where a new world order is emerging. The war in Ukraine, and now also the war involving Iran, have both given this development a new momentum, an enormous new momentum. And that's exactly what these words reflect.
Das kommt auch in diesen Worten zum Ausdruck. Das heißt also,
that means the world order the United States built after 1945, with the American dollar as the global reserve currency, has come under massive pressure. And these are developments we in Europe have to take into account for ourselves. That's why I've been advocating for years what I call Europe's self-assertion. By that I mean self-assertion politically, economically, technologically, and to some extent also militarily. To some extent, because I still believe our security is best guaranteed within NATO. But that would mean strengthening the European pillar of NATO to the point where, if it really came down to it, we wouldn't have to rely on the United States.
Nicht auf die Vereinigten Staaten angewiesen sind, dass wir in der Lage sind,
that we're able to protect our own security in Europe, including through a military balance. That's a crucial point. But we must not cut our ties with the United States. In fact, I believe that strengthening the European pillar within NATO would actually reinforce America's commitment to its allies and to the alliance itself. And that's especially important when we talk about nuclear strategy. In that area, the United States is absolutely essential for our security.
Sind die Vereinigten Staaten für unsere Sicherheit unverzichtbar.
Inzwischen tragen die Europäer die
By now, the Europeans are carrying the main burden of the war in Ukraine. Has President Trump managed to turn the Ukraine war into a European issue? Or are the Europeans acting on their own? Are they pursuing their own course? Are they the ones escalating? Or is this more like a division of labor with the United States?
Arbeitsteilung mit den Vereinigten Staaten.
Ja, wir haben ja davon gesprochen, dass es ein Stellvertreterkrieg.
Yes, we've talked about this being a proxy war. It's called a proxy war because the United States played a very decisive role, we have to say, in this war in Ukraine. Now, it's still a proxy war, but it's our war. It's the Europeans' war. The Americans are still making an important contribution to supporting Ukraine, even if that's not always so visible. But the real burden, the financial burden, and especially the material one, rests on the shoulders of the Europeans. And that burden will grow even more once peace is achieved and it's time to rebuild Ukraine. We really have no clear idea yet, it seems, of what kind of burdens our involvement will place on us, and especially on future European and German generations.
Durch unser Engagement. Die Amerikaner haben versucht, insbesondere Trump.
The Americans tried, especially Trump personally tried, to bring the two warring sides to the negotiating table. For a while, there was some progress, but then Trump's interest faded. He shifted his focus to the war with Iran. Right now, it's very hard to assess the situation. The key question, of course, is this: does what was agreed in Anchorage still stand or not? If it no longer stands, then Russia, as we've discussed, will have no choice but to rely solely on its own strength, and will try to end this war by military means. And that's exactly what happened with Iran as well. Iran also had to rely only on its own strength, and in the end, it prevailed.
In Wiesbaden,
In Wiesbaden, at the American bases, satellite data is processed, and the Ukrainian artillery spotters basically get it straight on their iPads, allowing them to use their weapons almost in real time. The Americans could force Ukraine to come to the negotiating table by stopping the transfer of that satellite data. Why isn't Washington doing that?
Warum tut Washington das nicht?
Ja, das ist genau der Punkt. Der Krieg, wenn die
Yes, that's exactly the point. European support is essential for waging the war. American support is essential when it comes to the question, can the war be ended now, or will it continue? It's just as you said. If the American systems used by Ukraine were to fail, and that's not even counting the staff from American organizations still working in advisory roles there. But if that support, like the Palantir system I mentioned earlier, or for example Musk's Starlink system, which is absolutely crucial for Ukraine, if that were suddenly shut down overnight, the war would be over. That needs to be said very clearly.
Das muss man ganz deutlich sagen. Die Amerikaner tun das nicht. Warum tun sie das nicht?
The Americans aren't doing that. Why not? There could be several reasons. I don't like to speculate about it. On one hand, it would mean that Ukraine would end up in a negotiating position similar to that of a country that suffered a military defeat. And that's something the Americans don't want. I also think that's the wrong approach, because both sides need to be able to represent and assert their national interests, their national security interests. And that is possible. I really believe it is. As you may know, I've made proposals myself that aimed exactly at that and actually led to that kind of outcome.
Genau das zum Ziel hatten und auch zu diesem Ergebnis kamen. Das kann einer der Gründe sein. Der andere Grund kann
That could be one of the reasons. The other reason, of course, might be that people don't want to put Russia, so to speak, the other side of the coin, into a clear position of victory. Because, if those systems were shut down, no one could really predict whether Russia would actually stop there, or whether it might take the opportunity to push further. These are considerations that have to be weighed very carefully when thinking about such an option, and it would also have to be discussed with both sides in advance. The possibilities exist, but as far as we know, they're not being used.
Genutzt werden sie, so viel wir wissen, nicht.
Man kann aus der Kuba-Krise
We can learn from the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 and how it was resolved that a lot depends on whether two leaders at the very top are able to build trust with each other. The young U.S. President John F. Kennedy, as one might say, came to trust the old Stalingrad veteran Khrushchev, and the two of them reached an understanding, essentially an agreement without a formal treaty, that the Russians would pull back their missiles, while the Americans, with some delay, would remove theirs from Turkey. So, is trust at the highest level necessary if we want to find any kind of solution to the conflict in Ukraine?
Eine Lösung des Konflikts in der Ukraine zu erreichen?
Selbstverständlich. Das ist ein ganz entscheidender Punkt.
Of course, that's a very important point. And you could get the impression that following that meeting between Putin and Trump in Anchorage in August of last year, a sense of trust began to develop. That's the impression I have. And if you look at the whole setup of that visit, that was clearly the intention, at least Trump's intention, because that airfield was the starting point for transferring American fighter planes to the Soviet Union during the war with Germany. And during those years of war, while those planes were being moved, 8 Russian pilots were killed. They're buried right there at that airfield.
Auf diesem Flugplatz beigesetzt sind. Und so, man kann den vielleicht,
And you could say, maybe that's reading too much into it, but a lot of people have criticized the fact that Putin was literally given the red carpet treatment there, that the reception was deliberately staged to look grand, that American fighter jets even flew over, and things like that. You could get the impression that Trump wanted to evoke the old wartime alliance from World War II. And if that's the case, it must have made quite an impression on Putin.
das natürlich bei Putin einen enormen Eindruck hinterlassen. Und wenn man auch die Art des Zusammentreffens,
And if you look at the way that meeting took place, even the outward details, you can see there was a broad understanding between them. That's also shown by the fact that there was obviously some kind of agreement, let me call it that, though you could use different terms, between the two. By the way, Putin confirmed that arrangement again a few days later. On August 18th, 3 days after their meeting, there was that gathering of several European heads of government and Zelensky at the White House.
Und Zelensky im Weißen Haus. Wir erinnern sich, Zelensky ging es dabei darum, von den
You might remember, Zelensky was trying to get a commitment from the Americans to supply long-range Tomahawk cruise missiles. Trump didn't do that. He didn't reject it outright. He just said, "We need them ourselves. We can't give them away." But we also know there was a phone call between Putin and Trump the night before, where Putin once again confirmed the agreement that had been reached a few days earlier in Anchorage. So that shows how important it was to him, before the visit from the Europeans and Zelensky, to emphasize once more their shared position and common understanding.
If there was an agreement in Anchorage last August, who undermined it?
Wer hat sie hintertrieben?
Naja, ob sie hintertrieben wurde, weiß ich nicht.
Well, I don't know if it was undermined. There's a timing connection between the G7 meeting and the questioning of that agreement. And according to media reports, it was supposedly the French president who made it public. I can't say whether that's true. It's possible that it was discussed in Evian. It's also possible that Trump, who's known for acting and making policy in a very erratic way, actually changed his mind.
Politik macht, tatsächlich seine Meinung geändert hat. Das hat ja mehrfach in der Vergangenheit gemacht.
He's done that several times in the past. But whether it's actually reliable, we don't know. The fact that the U.S. Secretary of State explicitly emphasized that it wasn't an agreement but rather a proposal that both sides, Putin included, accepted, has two implications. First, it confirms what happened. And second, it makes clear that the Americans don't consider themselves bound by it. Otherwise, he wouldn't have stressed that it wasn't an agreement, just an understanding.
Well, if the Americans don't feel bound by it, then why should the other parties in the conflict, the Europeans, the forces in Kiev, or the Russians, feel bound by it?
Well, the Russians obviously don't feel bound by it. It was a two-sided agreement, after all. So the Russians clearly have the impression that the Americans are no longer sticking to that understanding. And that's exactly what we're seeing right now on the battlefield. Intensified Russian attacks, growing pressure on the Ukrainian defensive lines, and the risk that there could actually be a breakthrough, especially in that area the Ukrainians call a fortress, with those three cities, Kramatorsk in particular. And beyond that, as we know, there's a huge stretch of land, more than 140, maybe 150 kilometers, that practically can't be defended.
Why are the Russians using so few Eurotechs in their attacks on Ukraine's infrastructure? Do they just not have many? Or how do you assess that?
Yes, that's how I see it. The first strike that took place was basically a test attack. It served two purposes at once. On the one hand, it produced the effect they wanted to achieve, and at the same time, it allowed them to measure, almost down to the millimeter, whether the system worked exactly as planned. And we're not just talking about a single missile here, but about one equipped with 6 independently controllable warheads. So, of course, it's crucial to know whether the guidance system for those warheads actually works, whether those 6 different targets can be hit precisely with a single launch. That was already possible during the very first deployment, and the data was analyzed and measured accordingly. But that also means that up to that point, not many rockets had been produced, and only afterward did they start ramping up full-scale production. So it's quite clear that, first, there still aren't that many rockets for this system, and second, it's a valuable, high-end weapons system, something you'd only use when the targets are truly significant.
wenn tatsächlich die Ziele auch hochwertig sind.
An der Front kommen die Ukrainer zunehmend.
At the front, the Ukrainians are coming under increasing pressure. The Russian advance is moving forward, slowly but steadily. A large number of Ukrainian forces are being worn down. The latest figures from Russian hackers claim that 2.4 million Ukrainian soldiers have been killed or seriously wounded. Do you think those numbers are realistic?
Halten Sie diese Angaben für realistisch?
Also ich kann es nicht beurteilen.
Well, I can't really judge that. You have to make distinctions here. Both sides are publishing numbers that should be treated with great caution. Putin recently mentioned some very precise figures that I think might not be all that far from reality. But even so, we need to be very careful. It's true, of course, that the attacker, who always has to expose themselves to the defender in a fortified position, is at greater risk than the defender. That can shift, of course. We saw that during Ukraine's major summer offensive in 2023, which failed with heavy losses. And we also saw it in the Ukrainian attack on the Kursk region, which likewise ended in failure with significant losses.
Der auch mit großen Verlusten gescheitert ist. Das ist einfach eine Tatsache.
That's simply a fact. But to say precisely how many have been killed and how many seriously wounded on one side or the other, there are just too many attacks, too much disinformation. Not long ago, a study from an American institute came out that reported extremely high numbers for Russian losses and unrealistically low ones for Ukrainian losses. So I approach that with the greatest caution, but I just want to make it clear for our viewers. When we talk about losses, we mean soldiers who've been killed, and those so badly wounded that they can't be deployed again, even after recovery.
Auch nach der Genesung nicht mehr eingesetzt werden können. Die beiden Zahlen ergeben zusammen die
The two figures together make up what's called the losses. Now, if you want to get a sense of the situation, there are, of course, some indicators that can give you a rough idea, even if they're not precise. For example, there have been exchanges of fallen soldiers, Russian and Ukrainian, and if I remember correctly, there have been 2 such exchanges recently. What you can see there is that the number of fallen Ukrainian soldiers handed over by Russia is extremely high, while the number of Russian soldiers handed over by Ukraine is very low. That's an indication, but of course it's not proof of the total number.
Für die Gesamtzahl.
Man sieht natürlich auch die großen Friedhöfe.
You can clearly see the large cemeteries in Ukraine, all those flags standing there. It's really a sea of graves, you could say. And I'm getting reports from Kiev that Zelensky is coming under increasing pressure. In American research circles, there's discussion about whether the Azov units in the military and the National Guard of Ukraine are still functioning. There's even talk now about whether a coup against Zelensky might be possible. There are indications that there have apparently been shootings in Kyiv and that 7 members of the military and intelligence services were shot because they had rebelled against Zelensky. Are you receiving any reports or information about this?
Aufgelehnt hätten. Erreichen Sie hier Hinweise, Informationen?
Also ich habe dazu keine Informationen.
Well, I don't have any information on that, and as I said, I don't like to speculate. We have to keep in mind that in this war, both sides are using targeted disinformation. What is true, though, is that Ukraine is facing serious personnel problems. That's one of the major difficulties it's struggling with in this war. You can see that, for example, in the reports about people on Ukrainian streets rounding up men, young men, but also older ones, who are then trained for just a few days and sent to the front without really being able to fight like properly trained soldiers.
Ausgebildete Soldaten zu kämpfen. Hinzu kommt, dass auch das Potenzial.
In addition, the pool of soldiers who could actually be drafted in Ukraine is much smaller than in Russia. So this really is a dramatic development. It means, above all, that the front line, the defensive line, can no longer be held together continuously. Instead, they have to form rapid response units that are deployed at key points of a Russian attack, constantly move back and forth, while the front itself remains relatively thinly manned. Right now, Ukraine still has the advantage of operating in fortified areas around Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. That certainly helps their defensive capability, but it won't last forever.
Aber das ist auch nicht von Dauer. Das muss man ganz klar sagen.
Ich bin auf russischer Seite.
That really needs to be said clearly. I was detained several times by the Russian side in Ukraine during this war, and once I was held together with Ukrainian deserters who had fled to the Russian side. You yourself mentioned forced mobilization and forced recruitment. So can we say that support for the current Ukrainian government among its own people is fading because people are longing for peace?
Das ist schon lange der Fall. Das ist schon, schauen Sie, das ist
That's been the case for quite some time. Look, this is really a normal development. When the son, the son-in-law, or the husband doesn't come back from the war, or comes back crippled, a country simply can't sustain that in the long run. That means we've been seeing a growing distance between the established government and the population for quite a while now. On top of that, the long duration of the war means there are no elections taking place. So President Zelensky remains in office well beyond the term confirmed by his election, and he's increasingly being questioned. We often hear in our media that Putin's support among the Russian population is steadily declining. And of course, there's criticism there. We've already talked about that. But this development is much more pronounced in Ukraine than it is in Russia.
Diese Entwicklung ist in der Ukraine wesentlich stärker ausgeprägt als in Russland.
In
Russia, Putin still has approval ratings of over 70%, according to independent institutes. Chancellor Friedrich Merz could only dream of numbers like that.
Many Western politicians could only dream of that.
The West keeps fueling the war in Ukraine. The European Union has already poured 360 billion euros into this war. Is it supposed to go on until the last Ukrainian?
Naja, ob geführt werden soll, das
Well, whether he should be led, I really doubt that. But the development is clearly moving in that direction. The problem is that this aspect isn't being taken into account in the West's support. Instead, people rely on what the Ukrainian government says. They hope there might actually have been a turning point. And they believe, just as German politicians often put it, that Russia cannot win this war militarily. That's a completely absurd claim, one has to say.
Feststellung, muss man sagen. Alles das spielt natürlich dabei eine Rolle. Letztlich
All of that, of course, plays a role here. In my view, it ultimately comes down to this. People want to use the idea of just keep going as before to justify what they've done so far. They don't want to admit that this kind of support, meaning not questioning the support for a country under attack, but continuing this form of support without trying to end the war, has actually failed. And that's why they just keep doing what they've been doing, to avoid making that admission, that obviously necessary admission.
notwendige Eingeständnis vermeiden will.
Der slowakische Premierminister Robert Fico.
The Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico recently said that, in effect, NATO is already at war with Russia. You can see that, he argued, from the large number of mercenaries and special forces already operating on Ukrainian soil. So when will it be said, Germans to the front?
Tätig sind. Wann wird es heißen, die Deutschen an die Front?
Naja, das wird es nicht heißen. Also das davon.
Well, that's definitely not what it means. I'm absolutely certain of that. We can see that more and more people in Germany are realizing we're heading into a dead end. What we're doing through our policies, by not actively and constructively working toward a peace solution, but instead continuing to fuel this war, means we're taking on guilt for the fate of the Ukrainian people. And I think more and more people are starting to understand that. Besides, the hurdles in our constitution for deploying German armed forces are set very, very high.
Den Einsatz solcher Streitkräfte sehr, sehr hochgelegt. Also wir bräuchten ein UN-Mandat, wir bräuchten eine.
Well, we'd need a UN mandate, and we'd need a decision from Parliament. I don't think that's something that could be pushed through in Germany. It's true that there's a significant number of foreign mercenaries in Ukraine. People are talking about 50,000 or more. And of course, that kind of involvement raises questions. I don't want to go into all the details right now, but naturally, it raises questions, just like the fact that there are foreign staff and foreign organizations active there in Ukraine.
Are Western troops being given leave to go fight in Ukraine?
I don't know.
If you look at Western politics with the current generation of politicians who've tied their own fate to supporting Ukraine and to the war in Ukraine, there's simply no way to find a path back to peace.
Yes, that's a major problem. It's hard for any politician to say what we did over the last 4.5 years was wrong. No politician likes to admit that. So there has to be a new situation that justifies a change of course. But the key point is this: that new situation doesn't just happen on its own. It has to be created. And we have to play an active role in making it happen. That active role can't look like those 5 points the so-called E3 adopted some time ago. It has to be a real effort to reach a compromise, to create the conditions for a compromise that takes both sides' interests into account. Ukraine must not lose this war militarily. If that happens, if there's a dramatic military defeat, then the very existence of the Ukrainian state is at risk. And that cannot be in our interest.
What could a peace solution look like, in your view? I'm asking because you've already made some proposals. Can we build on those ideas?
I don't know, I haven't heard any reactions to it so far. But if we talk about the two main points, the two most difficult ones, and you can compare that with what happened in Istanbul, but let's just focus on those two critical issues. One is Ukraine's NATO membership, and increasingly, the question of Ukraine joining the European Union. On NATO membership, as I've explained, I don't see any way to bring about a positive development for Ukraine in that form. The only truly positive outcome for Ukraine when it comes to security and independence would be a European peace and security framework. That's the key point. And that, of course, assumes that there's first a peace treaty, a peaceful resolution of this conflict. So that's one main point. The other is the territorial issue, and here it's mainly about the two people's republics of Luhansk and Donetsk. Russia has recognized them as independent states. I've proposed that both sides show a willingness to compromise on this question, meaning that Russia would confirm the independence of those two states, which it already declared back in February 22. That would mean they wouldn't become part of the Russian Federation, but it would also mean that Ukraine recognizes the independence of those two regions. And they would be separated from the Ukrainian state. But that also means there has to be an arrangement that ensures a positive path toward full sovereignty and independence. In other words, these two republics would need to come under a UN mandate, and the UN would have to act as the stabilizing factor here. That's not unheard of. It's happened quite often in the past, though not so much recently. For example, countries that emerged from colonial rule were sometimes placed under UN trusteeship, that's the correct term. And over the course of several years, they developed further toward real independence and full sovereign status. That's the proposal I made, and it requires compromises from both sides. But it would also have the advantage that, in a sense, those two states would form a kind of buffer zone between Russia and Ukraine. And if on top of that, Ukraine were to commit itself to permanent neutrality and independence from any alliances, and actually reaffirm that, then we'd basically have a relatively stable regional security order. But then there are the other two regions, Zaporizhia and Kherson. As far as I know, Russia has said it's willing to return significant parts of those areas to Ukraine, which are now being held by Ukrainian forces.
Wesentliche Teile deshalb, weil Russland daran
Key parts of that area are important because Russia wants to keep the land corridor between Russia and Crimea. Otherwise, there'd only be the Kerch Bridge, and that's always a weak point. Now, there's something else. This was actually the original proposal we made back in January. In 2023, we had already made a different one, but that was overtaken by events. Now, something new has come up that makes things more complicated. And that's the fact that Russia, as I mentioned, is trying to establish a security corridor in the northern area because of the Ukrainian incursion into the Kursk region. That means we're talking about the area around Sumy. Russia won't give that up, and of course that makes the whole situation more complex.
Und das kompliziert natürlich die gesamte Lage. Das heißt, letzten Endes
That means, in the end, it would basically come down to permanent neutrality, a limitation of Ukraine's armed forces, just as it was laid out in the Istanbul Agreement. No NATO membership, of course, no foreign troops on Ukrainian territory, and possibly an autonomous status for the two Donbass regions, as provided for in the Minsk II Agreement.
So wie im Minsk II-Abkommen vorgesehen war. Dieser Autonomiestatus sollte ja, so war die Vereinbarung in Minsk.
This autonomous status was supposed to be guaranteed through a constitutional amendment, as agreed in the Minsk II Accords. That means the Russian language would be allowed again, Russian culture would be recognized, and a certain degree of administrative autonomy would be established, though still within the Ukrainian state. That would have been, so to speak, the alternative to what I just described. But Ukraine didn't follow through on that agreement at the time. The constitutional amendment was supposed to be completed by the end of 2015, and that didn't happen. And that also contributed to the outbreak of the civil war we talked about earlier.
Member of the European Parliament Michael von der Schulenburg is launching a new initiative. He wants to bring together experts from the military, politics, and culture, both from Russia and from Germany, outside of official government channels. He says Germany is the decisive force, or can become the decisive force in shaping peace. Will you take part?
Ja, das weiß ich noch nicht. Ich muss das Projekt erst
I don't know that yet. I need to get to know the project better first, and that hasn't happened so far. I want to make 2 points about it. First, because of our history, because of the First and Second World Wars, and especially the Second World War with the attack on the Soviet Union, we have a special responsibility, including toward Russia, and also toward the one that was attacked, Russia in Ukraine. Second, Russia is our neighbor on the European continent, and it will always remain our neighbor. And third, there really needs to be authorization from the federal government for this.
Durch die Bundesregierung erfolgen. Ich würde sehr dafür plädieren, wenn die Bundesregierung nicht schon
I would strongly argue that if the federal government itself isn't ready, if it has, so to speak, suspended its foreign and security policy, right at a time when it's crucial to pursue such a policy actively, then it should at least be willing to support this initiative, not by committing to accept whatever outcome it produces, but simply by saying, in principle, we agree that such an initiative should go forward. We consider it important. We'll take a close look at the results. But for now, that's all we can say. Maybe one more point. Of course, if we're making our own efforts in this area, those efforts shouldn't be disrupted. Okay, but to me, that goes without saying. That's really what I would expect from a government that's forward-looking, politically capable, and acts responsibly.
Erwarten würde.
Sagt Harald Kujat, der frühere Generalinspektor.
That's what Harald Kujat, the former Inspector General of the German Armed Forces, says. He expects that if the federal government is going to suspend its own security and peace policy, it should at least not stand in the way of peace efforts. Thank you very much for that. Here at Against the Current, we show you positions and perspectives that the propaganda media keep hidden.
Welche die Propagandamedien verschweigen.